The mornings were always the same. Nora would sip her coffee in silence, the faint tick of the kitchen clock a metronome for her thoughts. At 52, her life had settled into a rhythm that, while predictable, often felt more like a melody played in a minor key. Widowed for 6 years, and with her 2 children grown, her days unfolded with a kind of quiet monotony. There was comfort in the familiar, but also a yearning for something unnamed and undefined. The grocery store was a place she visited twice a week, not just for necessities but for the semblance of purpose it gave her afternoons. She moved through the aisles methodically, checking her list, until an unexpected detour changed everything. It was the cereal aisle. She had just reached for her usual granola when her hand collided with another. She looked up startled, to meet the warm brown eyes of a man perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s. He smiled, a lopsided, boyish grin that made her heart stumble for reasons she couldn't quite place. "Oh, sorry about that," he said, pulling his hand back but keeping his gaze on hers. No, my fault," Nora replied, her voice steady despite the inexplicable flutter in her chest. He chuckled, motioning toward the granola box in her hand. "Good choice. It's my favorite too." The exchange was brief, no more than a few sentences. But as he walked away, Nora felt a lingering warmth, as if a candle had been lit in the shadows of her day. She shook her head, chiding herself for the silly, adolescent thrill of the moment, and continued her shopping. Yet as she drove home, his image, a kind face framed by unruly curls, kept drifting back into her mind. That evening, as she prepared her solitary dinner, the memory of the brief encounter returned unbidden. It wasn't just his appearance that lingered but the way he had made her feel seen, if only for a moment, as someone more than a woman in the midst of middle age, blending into the background of life. Nora dismissed the thought with a self-deprecating laugh. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself. It was just a random moment, a chance meeting. Yet deep down, she knew something had shifted, ever so slightly, in the rhythm of her quiet days that it started innocently enough. The next time Nora went to the grocery store, she found herself scanning the aisles, not for granola or milk but for him. She shook her head at her own foolishness. What were the chances? Yet, as if fate had been eavesdropping, she saw him again, this time in the produce section, inspecting a pineapple. "Trying to figure out if it's ripe?" she asked, surprising even herself with the boldness of her question. He looked up, his grin as warm as she remembered. "Yeah, apparently, knocking on it is a thing, but I'm pretty sure I look like an idiot." She laughed, the sound coming out lighter than she expected. "You're supposed to check if it smells sweet at the base," she offered, stepping closer. He held the pineapple out to her. "Care to give it a try?" She leaned in, inhaling the fruit's fragrance. "This one's good. Sweet, but not overripe." "Well, now I know who to consult for all my produce questions," he said, placing the pineapple in his basket. "I'm Ian, by the way." "Nora," she replied, a bit more self-conscious now. She felt her cheeks flush but hoped it wasn't obvious. Their conversation stretched longer this time. They talked about their favorite meals to cook, the best local spots for fresh ingredients, and how grocery shopping always seemed to take longer than planned. Nora learned Ian was a chef at a small restaurant nearby, and he was shopping for a dinner menu he was experimenting with. "I'd love to hear how it turns out," she said, immediately regretting how eager she sounded. "Tell you what," Ian said, his grin widening. "If it's a disaster, I'll spare you the details. But if it's a hit, maybe I'll bring you a sample." Nora's chest fluttered, caught between flattery and disbelief. "I'll hold you to that." As they parted ways, her steps felt lighter, and her heart hummed with an unfamiliar rhythm. For the first time in years, she found herself looking forward to her next grocery run. It wasn't just about the food anymore, it was about the possibility of running into Ian again. Their encounters became more frequent. Ian seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her life, and the stories she shared. He'd ask about her favorite recipes, her children, and her thoughts on anything from local news to the changing seasons. Nora found herself laughing more, smiling more, and even cooking more creatively, sometimes just to have something new to discuss with him. The budding friendship felt effortless, almost natural, yet it came with an undercurrent of something deeper. She couldn't ignore how her pulse quickened when he leaned in to share a joke, or how her evenings felt a bit emptier when she hadn't seen him that day. For the first time in years, Nora's predictable life had begun to shift. And though she tried not to dwell on what it meant, she couldn't help but wonder if Ian felt it too. One evening, after a long day at work, Nora found herself standing in her small, warmly lit kitchen. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the counter, and the gentle hum of her favorite jazz playlist filled the air. As she stirred a pot of soup, her thoughts drifted, inevitably, unavoidably, to Ian. It had been weeks since their first meeting at the grocery store, and what started as casual conversations had blossomed into something richer. He had dropped off a container of roasted squash ravioli from his restaurant a few days ago, along with a cheeky note. Nora tested Ian approved. She still had the note pinned to her refrigerator. Her feelings for him had crept up on her, subtle at first, like a melody playing faintly in the background. But now they were loud and undeniable, as if a symphony had erupted in her heart. The realization hit her all at once. This wasn't just admiration or fondness. She was falling for him. She sat down at her kitchen table, wine in hand, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. How had this happened? How had a woman like her, steady, cautious, rooted in practicality, allowed herself to feel this way about someone like Ian? The age difference loomed in her thoughts like an uninvited guest. Ian was likely in his mid-30s, maybe a little older. His youthful energy, his sharp wit, the way he seemed to embrace life with open arms, it all stood in stark contrast to her own measured existence. And yet, when she was with him, she didn't feel old. She felt seen, heard, alive in a way she hadn't in years. But with those feelings came fear, fear of judgment, fear of rejection, and most of all, fear of overstepping an invisible boundary. What if her feelings were one-sided? What if he only saw her as a mentor, a confidant, or simply a friendly face? The thought made her heart ache. She hadn't allowed herself to dream for so long, content instead to play the role of the dependable mother, the kind neighbor, the unassuming woman at the back of the room. But now, the spark Ian had ignited within her was impossible to ignore. Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't rush this, wouldn't let her emotions spiral out of control. But she also wouldn't close herself off. For the first time in years, someone, had made her feel like the best chapters of her story might not be behind her. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Nora knew she owed it to herself to see where it might lead. Nora's feelings for Ian began to unearth a whirlwind of emotions she hadn't felt in decades. The exhilaration of liking someone was intoxicating, but it quickly became tangled with doubt and fear. She lay awake at night, replaying every interaction they'd had. His easy laugh, the way he leaned forward when she spoke, the warmth in his eyes. Did he see her as more than a friend? Or was this all in her head? Her inner voice wasn't kind. Don't be ridiculous, Nora. He's young. He probably sees you as some quirky older woman, a mentor at best. The thought stung, and she tried to push it away. But another voice, the quiet, hopeful one, whispered, "What if he doesn't?" She found herself analyzing everything. The way his texts always seemed to come late at night when conversations felt intimate. How he had once brushed a leaf off her coat sleeve and lingered just a moment too long. Were these signs? Or was she reaching for something that wasn't there? More than anything, she was afraid of what people would think. The age gap was undeniable. Society had its judgments, especially when an older woman was involved. She pictured the raised eyebrows, the whispered comments. What does he see in her? What's she trying to prove? One afternoon, her best friend Laura came over for tea. Nora had confided in Laura about Ian, though carefully omitting her deeper feelings. "He's just different," Nora said, stirring her tea. "He makes life feel lighter, like I'm allowed to enjoy things again." Laura smiled knowingly. "You deserve to feel that way. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." It was a comforting sentiment, but Nora wasn't sure she believed it. She spent days oscillating between hope and doubt, excitement and apprehension. The thought of risking their friendship was terrifying, but so was the idea of staying silent and wondering what if for the rest of her life. The tipping point came one evening when Ian texted her a picture of a sunset from a park they'd once walked through together. "Thought of you when I saw this." Her breath caught. She stared at the message, her heart pounding. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't imagining it after all. Nora stood in her kitchen, the warm light of the evening sun casting a soft glow over the room. The weight of the decision she had been wrestling with hung in the air like an unspoken promise. Ian's message had stirred something in her, a realization that she couldn't ignore anymore. The thoughts she had kept hidden, buried beneath the mundane routine of her life, had emerged with a sharp clarity. She wanted to see him, not just as a friend, but as someone who had come to mean more to her than she could admit. The idea of inviting him over had been forming slowly, but now it felt almost like a need. She had never entertained the idea of opening up her space to anyone outside her small circle. But this was different. There was something about Ian that made her want to take the risk, to see where the connection between them might go. But she hesitated. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if she misread the signals and ruined everything? Nora had learned long ago not to expect too much, to keep her heart safe and her desires tucked away. Yet, there was a soft whisper in her mind, coaxing her to take a step forward. She put the kettle on for tea and started pacing the kitchen. The decision felt monumental. Her hands trembled slightly as she composed a text to him, debating every word. She didn't want to appear too eager, but she couldn't hide her desire to spend time with him either. "Hey Ian, I was thinking, would you like to come over sometime? I'm making a pot roast this weekend, and it would be nice to have some company." She reread the message. It sounded casual enough, but there was an underlying vulnerability in the invitation. Her breath caught as she pressed send. Seconds passed like hours. She stared at her phone, waiting for the response. The silence was almost suffocating, but then, finally, the text came through. "I'd love that. Let me know when." Relief washed over her, but it was mixed with the excitement of what was to come. Nora's heart quickened as she set the phone down, her mind racing with possibilities. Ian would be in her home, in her space. The thought made her both giddy and nervous. She could already imagine the way the conversation would flow, the way he would laugh at her jokes, the way his eyes would soften when they spoke about their lives. There was no turning back now. As she set the table for two that night, Nora realized something she hadn't allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this moment. She was ready. Ready to explore whatever this was. Ready to open herself up to something that could change her world. The day Ian came over felt like it belonged to another world. One where Nora's careful control over her life was slipping away, bit by bit. She had spent the morning preparing, choosing the right wine, setting the table, and making sure everything was just so. Yet, despite the small details, her nerves were almost unbearable. She kept thinking, what if it's awkward? What if the connection fizzles out the moment he walks through the door? But then the doorbell rang and it all seemed to shift. Ian stood there, smiling in that familiar, easy way that made her heart skip a beat. He was holding a bottle of red wine, a small gesture that felt like something more than just politeness. He had come, and for a moment, that was all that mattered. "Hi, Nora," he said, his voice warm, and his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, not at all," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm glad you're here." They exchanged a brief, tentative hug, the kind that felt like the beginning of something more, yet still cautious. As they settled into the dining room, the hum of conversation started to flow naturally, like it always had when they'd met at the grocery store or at the park, but this time it felt different. More intimate, more alive. The meal was a success, and so was the evening. They talked about everything and nothing. About books they'd read, the music they liked, how the world had changed, and how they had both tried in their own ways to find meaning in it. Nora had always felt comfortable in Ian's presence, but now there was an undercurrent of something more, a shared understanding, a quiet intimacy between them that she couldn't quite put into words. As the night wore on, they moved from the dining room to the living room. Nora had lit a candle on the coffee table, and the soft flickering light created an atmosphere of warmth and connection. Ian sat beside her, their proximity charged with an undeniable tension. She could feel it in the air, thick and palpable, as if everything between them had shifted into something new. "I have to admit," Ian said after a moment, his voice quieter now, "this is more than I expected. I mean, I thought we'd have a good time, but this feels different." Nora's heart skipped. She swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of her glass. "Different how?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He paused, as though weighing his words carefully. "It's just being here with you." There's something about you, Nora. Something that's not just familiar. It's deeper. More meaningful. His words struck her like a chord being plucked from a distant place inside her. She felt her breath catch, the recognition of her own feelings surging to the surface. She had felt it too, but hearing him say it out loud made her realize how long she had been denying it. They were no longer two people casually meeting and passing. This was something real, something beyond the surface level of age, expectation, or social judgment. Nora started, but her voice faltered. Ian reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers, grounding her in that moment. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to say anything." But she did. She needed to. With a steady breath, Nora turned to face him, her voice trembling just slightly as she spoke the words she hadn't let herself acknowledge until now. "I'm feeling it too," she said, her heart laid bare. "And I'm scared, but I don't want to ignore it anymore." Ian's eyes softened, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a slow, soothing motion. "We don't have to have all the answers right now, Nora. We don't need to figure it out today. Just, let's take this one step at a time." The words hung between them like a promise. In that moment, with the warmth of the candlelight and the quiet comfort of his presence, Nora felt a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't about having all the answers. It was about embracing the unknown, about acknowledging the connection they shared without fear of what others might think. They were here, together, and that was enough for now. As the evening wore on, Nora found herself leaning in closer, the space between them disappearing. There were no more doubts, only the quiet certainty that something had shifted between them, something deep and unspoken, and it was only just beginning. The following days were filled with a quiet reverence for what had happened between them. Nora couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed, but in the most subtle of ways. As much as she tried to compartmentalize it, keep it separate from her routine, she found herself thinking of Ian in moments when she least expected it. The way he smiled, his laugh, the way his eyes lingered on her just a moment longer than necessary. It all stayed with her, tucked into the crevices of her daily life, like a whisper she could no longer ignore. She had always thought that love had a certain shape, a certain expectation. In her mind, it had been something tied to age, to a particular point in life, a road that one followed, full of milestones and well-defined markers. But Ian had thrown that belief into disarray. He was younger, certainly, but that difference no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like an opportunity. There were times when she would catch herself staring at the reflection in the mirror, wondering how she could look so ordinary, so much older than she felt inside. She would run her fingers through her silvering hair and think of how the world had often made her feel invisible, unworthy of anything that wasn't anchored in practicality. Love had always seemed like something for the young, for the vibrant, for those who had time on their side. Not someone like her, someone whose days were already mapped out, whose experience had taught her that time was a precious commodity, slipping away as quickly as it had arrived. But Ian had shattered that illusion. He had made her feel seen, not just for her past, not for the years etched in her skin, but for the woman she was in this moment. Alive, capable of feeling desire, of loving, of being loved. In his presence, Nora had rediscovered parts of herself that had been buried for too long. She felt more awake, more present, more open to the possibilities of what might come next. It was a kind of love that had no limits, no rules, no age restrictions. It was uncharted territory, yes, but it was a territory she was no longer afraid to explore. There was a freedom in that, freedom from the self-imposed constraints, freedom from the judgment of the world around her. And for the first time in a long time, Nora felt that she had permission to simply be. She had begun to wonder, on quiet evenings when she sat alone in her favorite armchair, what love really was anyway. Was it defined by age, or by the way hearts connected? Could it truly be measured by how much time you had left or how much time you had shared? What mattered was the way they made each other feel. The way Ian had come into her life and made her realize that there was so much more left to experience, to give, and to receive. Her heart had once been a guarded place, a place she had carefully kept shut away, afraid to let anyone in, especially after years of feeling overlooked and unseen. But Ian had slipped through the cracks, not with grand gestures, but with patience, with kindness, with the soft understanding that, together, They could navigate this fragile, beautiful thing called love, no matter the space between their years. And it was in those quiet, reflective moments that Nora realized she had never been more certain of anything in her life. Love, no matter the stage, was still love. It could bloom in the most unexpected places, at the most unexpected times. The power of it was not bound by age or circumstance, but by the simple truth that when two people connected, truly connected, the world could be remade. Nora closed her eyes and smiled softly, a sense of calm washing over her. Ian had opened her heart in ways she had not known were possible. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what the world might think, of what others might say. This love was hers, and it was enough. As the weeks passed, Nora found herself savoring the moments she spent with Ian, the warmth of his presence becoming as familiar as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. They no longer saw each other just occasionally, at the edges of their busy lives. Now there was a kind of continuity, a thread that bound their days together. They met for coffee at the small cafe by her apartment, their fingers brushing over the rim of their mugs. They walked through the park in the late afternoon, where the sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden streams, and shared quiet conversations about everything and nothing. Nora had long since stopped worrying about the age gap between them, or the looks they might get when they went out. The world had its own expectations, its own judgments, but Nora had learned to silence them. What she had with Ian was her own creation, a bond that was built not on appearances or conventions, but on genuine connection. They had built something together, quietly, in the way that only those who truly understand each other can. At night, Nora would sometimes lie awake, thinking about what had brought her to this place, this unexpected chapter in her life. She thought of the loneliness she had once felt, of the days that had passed in such a steady, predictable march. She thought of how she had nearly let that silence define her, let the years slip by without opening herself to the possibility of joy, of passion, of love. She had been afraid, in so many ways, afraid that it was too late for her, that love belonged to younger versions of herself, to people who hadn't yet crossed the threshold of middle age. But here she was in the middle of it all, wrapped in the arms of someone who made her feel seen, who saw beyond the years and into the soul that still burned with desire, still longed for connection. She had come to understand that love was not about timelines or expectations. It was about the moments that mattered, the connections that were built slowly, quietly, and with great care. She had learned that love could happen at any age, that there was no right time, no perfect moment. There was only the present, the right now, and the choices we made in it. And for Nora, the choice had been clear. She had chosen to let go of fear, to embrace the unexpected, to allow herself to be vulnerable again. She had chosen to live fully, to love without regret, without apology. And in doing so, she had discovered a truth she had never fully understood before. Love, at any stage of life, was worth the leap. As she stood in front of her mirror one evening, adjusting the blouse she had chosen for their dinner, Nora couldn't help but smile. There was a new light in her eyes, something not born of age, but of experience, of wisdom, of acceptance. The years had softened her, yes, but they had also given her a deeper understanding of herself, of what she was capable of what she deserved. She looked at the reflection before her, the woman who had weathered so many storms, the woman who had loved and lost, and who now, in the most unexpected of circumstances, had found a new kind of love, a love that was tender, unashamed, and filled with possibility. And as Ian arrived at her door that evening, his smile warm and welcoming, his eyes bright with affection, Nora realized something else. In all the years she had spent trying to control her life, trying to fit into a mold that the world had cast for her, the greatest gift had been learning to let go. She had let love find her, not in the way she expected, but in the way that was meant to be. As they sat down together, sharing the meal she had prepared for them, Nora took his hand in hers and realized that she was no longer just a woman in her 50s. She was someone alive with love, someone unafraid to embrace the beauty of the present, of the moment, of the future yet to come. And for the first time in years, Nora felt, truly felt, that everything was exactly as it should be.